Hi, everybody. My name is Minda Harts, and I use pronouns she, her, hers. I'm really honored to be here with you all today. Special thank you to the team at Out and Equal for having me this month to talk about being right within, how to heal from racial trauma in the workplace. You know, as we start to talk about this topic, I realize that it can be a little triggering for some people. And so I definitely want to hold space because I know many of us sit at various intersections. And so perhaps you're not a woman of color, perhaps you're not a person of color, but you've been marginalized or you've been the one of few or the only in the room. And if you've ever felt isolated in any way, shape, or form, then you probably have experienced some type of trauma. So I hope that even if your trauma in the workplace hasn't been racialized, that perhaps if you are LGBTQIA or you sit at a different intersection, perhaps you're a mother or a veteran or over 50, that you'll also see yourself in this conversation because we all have experiences. And at the end of our time together, I hope that we have tools to not only heal ourselves, but then heal the workplace as well. And so, again, my name is Minda Harts, and I'm really excited to embark on this conversation with you. One of my favorite activists and authors is Audre Lorde, and she said, they were so terrified because we were taught to respect fear more than ourselves. And oftentimes, when we're in the workplace and we're experiencing being marginalized to any degree, we have been conditioned to value fear over our own voices. And the one thing that I want to tell you today is that we all have a voice. We just have to decide how we want to use it. And I know that healing and some of these terms that we're going to talk about today may be trendy, but it's nothing trendy when you're feeling that trauma, when you're feeling that pain. And I spent 15 years in corporate America before becoming an entrepreneur, and I had settled into the bias. I don't know about you. Has anybody just settled into the bias? The stories that we tell ourselves, even about ourselves, can be pretty damaging, meaning, when I was the only Black woman working in my industry and in my company and in the rooms that I was in, I just started to tell myself that this is just the way it is for me, right? And you could fill in whatever intersection that you said at. Oh, this is just how it is for someone who's trans, or this is just how it is for someone who's Asian. We tell ourselves those things, but we can dismantle those stereotypes. We can dismantle those inequalities, and it's the work that we're doing today that helps dismantle that. But first, we have to realize that we could be working at the same place and experience that workplace very differently. So, someone that we work with some of us may never experience racial trauma in the workplace. Some of us may never experience homophobia, but somebody that's either on our team or that works with us or reports into us feels that every single day. So our goal should be able to remove barriers for people instead of creating more. And we definitely can do that. So I think it's really important to talk about origin stories. And I know that some of you may not know me personally, but I hope by our end of our time together that we'll become fast friends. And so in order to do that, let's just pretend that you're at my house on a Friday night or a Saturday night and we're just hanging out, and we have to start with how we got here. I like to sometimes feel like I am Beyonce, but I didn't wake up like this. As I told you, I was in my own kind of pit of despair in the workplace, and I had just kind of normalized the trauma that I was experiencing as a woman of color in the workplace. And so I want to talk to you about my road to healing. And the one thing that I want to say to you is that healing isn't always a one-time event. It has to be a lifestyle. And for me, I found out that it's everyday practices, right? After spending 15 years in my former life as being the only Black woman in most of the rooms that I was in, it didn't happen for me overnight. It took a lot of unpacking and it took a lot of naming. We can't conquer what we're not even willing to name. How many of you have experienced a certain inequality or in the workplace and you weren't even comfortable calling it what it was? You weren't even comfortable to say it was homophobia. You weren't even comfortable to call it sexism. You weren't even comfortable to call it racism. For so long, I never wanted to utter the words out because I knew that if I said it, um, it may have people look at me different. I might not get as, you know, high on the food chain as I once, dreamed of being. All of these different things that we sometimes, again, fear because we haven't actually stated our truth, because many of our environments haven't been safe to do that. And again, we're going to talk about how we create that safety as well. But in 2003, I'm going to make a very long story short, I graduated college. So now all of you can kind of figure out how old I am if you were curious, but we'll keep that on the low here. I graduated as the first person in my family to graduate from college, the first person in my family to enter into a corporate structure. All of my family had worked in various industries before, but I was the first to enter into corporate America. So I didn't always know the things that I didn't know. I don't know if anybody experienced that. And sometimes you're like the guinea pig, right? and I was just so excited to get into the workplace, to make money, to finally be out on my own, living my dream, independent. And when I entered into the workplace, my very first manager, we'll call him Chad for today, he saw that I had burnt orange fingernail polish on. And my manager, mind you, first person, he says to me, "Oh, you people love your bright colors." And he joked around for 15 minutes about how Black people like bright colors. That was my first experience. And my manager would go on to say those things several times a day. And I was the only Black woman working at this firm of hundreds of people. And I thought, well, if everybody else is saying that Chad isn't racist or he's just joking around and I'm taking it the wrong way, then that must be what it is. Right. So I swept it under the rug. It started in 2003. I thought that that's just the kind of treatment I had to deal with, right? And it wasn't until 2012 when the murder of Trayvon Martin happened. I was working at my company and I saw this demonstration, this conversation around Black Lives Matter. And I didn't quite understand it fully, but it made me start to no longer just keep my head down and not rock the boat, but it allowed me to look up to say, wow, what is going on, not just outside in the streets, but what's going on inside of our companies, inside of our organizations? What could it mean for everybody in the workplace to thrive and not just survive? Most of my career, yes, I was making good money, but I was barely surviving, right? I was respectability politics, code switching. I was doing all the things just to keep my head above water. And I started to interrogate and investigate what it could mean for Black and Brown people, for women of color, for people who look like me, anyone who feels like they're on the margins, to be able to have the tools. What could it mean for Black lives to matter on the About Us pages of our organization? What could it mean for pay equity? And I started to think about those things. But back in 2012, I had been in the workplace for a while now, and I had settled into some of the biases, and I even had some of my own, right? And I didn't think that the workplace probably would change much, and I was waiting on somebody else to save me. But what I found is that we can save ourselves, and we can also throw somebody a life jacket and help them as well. But as I was interrogating and investigating what that could mean for the workplace, um, I decided that I needed to leave my current company because I was experiencing a lot of micro and macro aggressions, but um, I was like, I just have to get out of here. Maybe it's not the right environment, right? And the one thing that I want to tell you all is sometimes that you're in certain situations where you're experiencing traumas in the workplace, and because we're often one of the only or a few, we'll sometimes tell ourselves that maybe we should have done something differently. Maybe it was our fault that these things were happening to us, and because when you don't have other people to affirm you, you sometimes go down this rabbit hole of thinking that you're the problem, right? And so I would sometimes think that if I worked harder, if I, wore my hair straight enough, all these different things, that maybe the inequalities that I was experiencing as a woman of color would be different. Maybe Chad wouldn't say the things that he said. Maybe my colleagues would no longer talk about my hair inside of meetings that had nothing to do with the bottom line. But I just grew accustomed to that. Again, this normalization of inequality, the normalization of the trauma. But at the time, I didn't have the language to articulate those things, so you sit with that. Lauren Hill said, how you going to win if you ain't right within? Many of us are sitting in our organizations, or we're leaders and we're not sure what to do, and we're just sitting with that, and that's causing us a lot of mental anguish along the way. And in 2013, I took a new job, and this particular job, which is really important to the story, is that I took this new role, for a great seat at the table, the pay, all the things that I thought that I wanted. At the time, it would have been my dream job. I'd finally ascended to that place on the ladder that I was really happy about. And this particular company said all the right things. They said that diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, all the things matter. And I'm like, you know what? I'd never heard that language before. And so this must be true, right? If they're saying this thing, then there must be some demonstration here. I don't know if any of you have worked at certain places and they say all the right things, and you're like, wait a second, no one ever talked like this belonging kind of language in my former employer. So maybe this has to be better, right? And so I take this role in 2013, and again, I was the only. Again, if you've been the only of anything, then you know how isolating that could be. But I had already spent most of my career at that time being the only. So I thought, well, I know what traumas that comes with, right? So let me just, continue on, because again, I just felt like this was probably just that's the way it is for us, right? And so I take this role, and if you've, I know we're talking about right within, but my first book, The Memo, really talks about my experience at this particular company, and I was experiencing so much aggression that my former life, I used to say it was subtle, but once I moved into this new company, it was really blatant. I would be in some meetings and they would say, well, what's the black girl think? And people would laugh and think that was funny. That was on a good day. And I would have to be inundated with all of these things each and every day. And I started to get panic attacks and anxiety. My mental health was really, really fragile, but I couldn't, at the time, I didn't have the language, I didn't have the resources to be able to articulate that what was causing these issues for me was the workplace, that certain personalities, certain triggers were affecting me in this way. So, for example, there was one colleague who was doing a lot of the aggression, and I noticed that whenever I was in a room with her in a meeting, I would start to get anxiety and panic attacks. And I could not for the life of me figure out why. I literally thought that I was losing my mind because I couldn't connect the dots of this was the environment, the toxicity was causing this mental health shift for me. Now, again, I was having one of the best on paper, one of the best career moments in my career, but mentally I was deteriorating by the day. And so I dealt with that for about a year in my new environment. And I thought, okay, maybe if I just work harder, if I bring Bob the red velvet cupcakes, if I go to happy hour, if I do all of these things, but I could have done cartwheels through the hallways, and the environment was never going to change because it was toxic, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But what ended up happening is I finally got to a place where I leveraged courage. And that's something that I want to talk to you all about. Is one definition of courage is the ability to do something that frightens one. And anytime we want to challenge status quo or dismantle status quo, it's going to require courage. And I want you to think about something. I want you to write this down. Who's going to be a beneficiary of my courage? Because it requires some action to dismantle these systems and ideologies that are taking place all around us that, again, may not affect you directly, but it is affecting someone that you work with each and every day. And so we have to think about it. We have to read books like Right Within. We have to attend sessions like this so that we understand how to be helpful for people and how someone can be a beneficiary of my courage. And one of the things I decided to do, again, reminding us that we all have a voice, that we don't just have to make everything work in the workplace at the expense of our own well being. I finally had a conversation with the most senior woman at the company, and I was pretty fragile at that particular time. But I went to her and I said, I really took this job because I was so excited. It's my dream job. But as you know, I've been experiencing a lot of racial aggression here, and I really need your support. I need your help because I love the work that I'm doing, but I can't function like this with my other colleagues. Can you do something about it? And she looked me dead in the face and she said, that I know these things are happening, Minda, but the person causing the harm, she's really great. She's been here for decades, and the clients love her. So you have to decide if this is a place you want to be or not. And I remember hearing her say that, and I felt like I wanted to cry because I had uprooted my life from one coast to the next. I had been a Black woman in the workplace my whole entire life, working career at that point, and I just wanted her to see me. And sometimes you just want to be seen, right? You just want to be heard. And for her to meet me with no courage, she met me with caution. And nobody benefits when we're cautious. But I often think about that moment in her office that had she been courageous to show up, to dismantle systems, what we could have done together. But there was no way that I could have done it alone. And one realization that I came to in her office that day was that I belong in every room that I enter, but not every room deserves to have me. But I couldn't see at the time that I was the prize, right? Because I had been in these toxic situations for so long. But one of the things that I could control was having that conversation. And I think whenever you're feeling overwhelmed, whenever you feel like you need to create some boundaries, no matter how scary that is, I hope that you'll lean into your courage because somebody will be a beneficiary of that conversation. It may not be you, it definitely wasn't me at that time. But I know that having that conversation did something, even for me at the time, even when it felt like I was met with the caution. But I tell you that story, and we're going to move here a little bit faster. But again, I think it's really important for you to understand how I even got to this healing journey of my own. Again, healing isn't a one time event, it's a lifestyle. I left her office that day. It was 2014. And I went back to my office. I grabbed my stuff. I went to my car. When I got to my car, I cried. I cried my tears. I cried my great grandmother's tears. I cried my grandmother's tears, I cried my mother's tears because we had all experienced racism in the workplace in different generations. And I was the first to make it to ascend to being a college graduate, being in corporate America, making more money than my parents combined when I was a youth. And I just thought, man, I've done everything that dominant culture has required of me, and still no humanity, no dignity, and they just couldn't see me. And I just felt so defeated because this also was my dream job. And oftentimes, when we're in workplaces that are toxic and racialized or any other isms that are happening inside the workplace, that this is affecting others. Again, it may not affect the woman that I had the conversation with directly, but it impacts retention and all these other things. Sometimes people don't see it's affecting everything, even when they don't maybe see it at the time. And I just remember sitting in the car and not knowing what to do because oftentimes when we're in very toxic workplace situations, we don't feel as if we can leave. We can't quit, right? And I had a lot of responsibilities at that time and I didn't feel like I could quit. So that pained me even more, right? And I sat in that car that day and I turned on the radio and I'm crying, my lashes are on the ground, feeling defeated. Like, God, I don't know that I can make it another 50 years working like this, like I was really having this come to Jesus moment with myself in the car. And Whitney Houston's "Where Do Broken Hearts Go" comes on the radio, and I'll never forget it. And I thought to myself, where do the broken hearts go of women of color when we can't take the workplace anymore? And it was in that moment that I said, I don't know what it looks like, but I'm going to figure out how we make the workplace work for everybody, how we have these conversations that have been taboo, that we no longer normalize them, that we don't sweep them under the rug. And it was in 2015. Again, in that car, I had no idea. I felt as defeated could be. But I said I would commit the rest of my life to making the workplace better than I found it. That if I could use my voice, use my story, use my courage so that someone would be a beneficiary of not just my voice, but healing, freedom. Essentially, at the core of this, we all want to be free to be who we need to be our healthiest self. Oftentimes in the workplace, the question is, how do you bring your authentic self to work? But really, we should be asking, how do we bring our healthiest self to work? Because if we're healthy, then we're going to bring those authentic pieces of ourself that we need to show up as. And so in 2015, I started my company, The Memo. And then in 2019, my first book was published by Hachette called The Memo: What Women of Color Need to Know to Secure a Seat at the Table. It was the first book by a major publisher to talk about the experiences of women of color in the workplace. And if you would have asked me back in 2014, if you would have asked me in 2003, would I be talking to you about this kind of stuff now? I would say no, because I had no idea that we could even talk about racism in the workplace, that we could talk about homophobia in the workplace, that we could talk about sexism in the ways that we're able to talk about it now. But that how we continue is we hold people accountable, but we also first make sure that we put our oxygen mask on first. And after The Memo, I wrote my next book that came out a few months ago called Right Within: How to Heal from Racial Trauma in the Workplace. Because what I realized was all of those years of racialized trauma, they don't just go away, it sits with you. And, I make the joke with some of my friends, oh, my colleagues have never seen the angry Black woman, but you know who has seen that, that side? The people I go home to, right? Because you've been in these toxic workplaces all day long for years and years, decades at a time for some of us. And then you go home, and the people that love you the most, that want the best for you, they don't get the best of you because you've been in this toxic environment. So healing is not just for you, it's for the people that love you too. And it's so important that we talk about healing from the traumas, be it racism or any other type of discrimination inside the workplace, so that we pass on tools of thriving to the next generation. That our work that we're talking about today is so critical because the next generation will benefit from the work we do today. The next generation will benefit from having no longer passing on tools of survival, those things like, oh, don't rock the boat, just keep your head down. Those are just survival tools. But now we can pass along healing tools, tools that people can thrive. The late great Dr. Maya Angelou said, "You may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them." So I know that some of you have had some really horrible experiences inside the workplace. And let me be the first to apologize on behalf of those workplaces, those managers that failed you, that you couldn't be who you needed to be in the workplace, that you might not even felt comfortable even being out at your organizations, right? I used to have a colleague that worked really closely and we became friends. And for a long time, they never had any pictures on their desk. And they had a whole life outside of work, but they were nervous. The traumas that they had about not being able to be who their healthiest self in the workplace because of all the toxicities in the workplace. And I often think about that colleague because I often think, if they had the space, if they had a good manager who they could have really shown up as their healthiest self inside the workplace, one where we got to see various sides of them. So, again, we can't control some of the things that our managers or colleagues might say or don't say, but we can control if we heal or not. We can control if we name the things that have caused us harm. In Right Within, I have so many different resources of things that help me along the way and frameworks, but one that I want to share with you, and you can also find it on my website at mindaharts.com under the Right Within tab. There is a PDF version of this pyramid, and I even have some women of color who screenshot it and they show it to me that they hang this in their cube or on their wall as they're experiencing different things. One of those things is the affirmation pyramid. And really quickly, it's a 5-step process because sometimes you may not have anybody in a meeting who can show up for you, but you can show up for yourself. Let me tell you something. You are your greatest asset. We can show up for ourselves. Oftentimes I'd be in certain meetings in my past and I'd be waiting on one of my colleagues to show up for me or say something. I can't be the only one that heard so and so say that comment, right? But for some reason, now everybody moves on to the next agenda item like there's nothing to see here. But while everybody else moves on, I'm still sitting with that pain. I'm still sitting with that trauma. And when something happens in a meeting, let's use the color scenario. My manager said, "You people love your bright colors," and he joked around for 15 minutes about how Black people like bright colors. With the affirmation pyramid, here's how it could work. So when that person says or does something, I can take a pause, right? I can breathe in and out. I don't have to respond in the moment. I don't have to defend myself if I don't want to. I can take a pause, right? We can do that. We can give our own self that space and that grace. Number two is acknowledge. And this is really important because oftentimes when we've been harmed inside the workplace, we won't even acknowledge it to ourselves. You can't name what you're not even willing to confront. So, for example, I was so in my head about Chad being racist or not being racist, which it had nothing to do with that really. At the core of it, I have to acknowledge that what he said was wrong. I don't have to make excuses for that person. I don't even have to talk to him about it if I don't want to, but I first can acknowledge it to myself because that's part of my healing, right? That someone has harmed me or said something that was egregious to me. I don't have to wait for someone else in the meeting to acknowledge that too. I can acknowledge that for my own self. Number three is documentation. This is really important because sometimes you are the only, and no one else is going to say the thing that you need to say. So, what can you do in that moment? You can document it because this isn't necessarily something you might take to HR, you might take it to your manager, but really this is for you. Because oftentimes what I found is when I was in a situation that was racialized or any type of discriminatory practice, I would then question if it really was that. And then I would kind of give people passes, right? Well, they were having a bad day or whatever the case may be. And I could document that because now I'm not making that up, right? No, I'm saying at 12:59 in Zoom room 5, Chad said X, Y, and Z. So now I'm writing that down because if I'm in another meeting where Chad says some things, now I can see that this isn't something I've made up. This isn't something I took the wrong way. I now have documentation if I ever need it to say, no, I didn't feel like that was homophobic or I didn't feel like that was ageist. Actually, this is what was said, and I'm rooting it in fact, right? Not just feeling. And I think that that's really good for us because it's releasing it from ourselves. You're no longer questioning if that thing was the thing. You actually know that it was the thing, right? So you're documenting it. And again, you can see if there's patterns taking place. And you can also use that to your advantage if you ever need to. Number 4 is redistribute that energy. I don't know about you, but whenever I was aggressed inside the workplace, and I use this outside the workplace too, but I redistribute the energy because when someone says something offensive inside a meeting or in an email, two things can be true at the same time. They might not have meant harm, but the impact was harmful to me, right? So, but what I would do with that is then I would play that scenario on a loop in my head, like my favorite Beyonce song, right? Does anybody else do that? I would just ruminate on that thing all day long. So now they said what they said at 9, now 10, 11, 12, till it's time for me to go home. If I'm working inside the a physical location, I'm thinking about that and I'm taking that stress, that trauma with me to every meeting, trying to figure out why did they say that? Why did they do that? Why didn't anybody else say anything? And you're ruminating. And you know what's happening when you're ruminating on that? It's causing chronic stress to your body and to your mind. And you can't be your healthiest inside the workplace when you're ruminating on that chronic stress, that trauma. And that trauma ends up showing up in other ways: high blood pressure, diabetes, high cholesterol, all these different things that can come from that stress inside your body. So it's really imperative that we grasp a hold of that and redistribute that energy. So now many of us are working from home, so you're sitting at your computer, you're thinking about that all day. You go to the kitchen, you're thinking about it while you're making dinner. You go to bed, you take it with you there. One of my favorite songs is by Erica Badu, and she had a song called Bag Lady, and then the lyric was, one day all of those bags gonna get in your way, so pack light. We all need to learn how to pack light, because what's happening is when we're replaying that thing that was said or done to us constantly, that person that said it or did it, they're not thinking about you anymore. They're not losing sleep after that comment that they said to you. They've moved on, right? They're watching The Tinder Swindler, they're watching Inventing Anna, they're watching all the docuseries that their hearts can desire, and they're not thinking about you, right? But here we are ruminating. So redistribute the energy. What is it that you need to put that into? So for me, it was therapy. It was working out. It was eating healthier. I needed to redistribute that energy so I don't take that with me. Number 5, affirm. This is very important. Again, when you're in a racialized or any type of discriminatory situation, having the right tools to fight those battles are key, right? It will help you in so many different ways. And if you're a leader or a manager, having tools to provide your team is really critical too. But number 5 is affirm yourself. What are the things that you need to tell yourself to remind yourself that you are more than enough, that you deserve humanity, dignity, equity, and respect in the workplace, and that you didn't do anything to warrant that type of behavior? Because I think, again, when we are one of few, sometimes we then are the only. We'll try to make it seem like, well, maybe something I could have done when it had nothing to do with you. That was that person's experience. Again, I probably sound like a broken record, but healing is not a one-time event. It's a lifestyle. And, what are you going to do to protect your mental health, your mental hygiene? Just like some of us go to the gym or we have different hobbies, we have to work those out. And so protecting our mental health is really important. But the one question I want to ask you is, what does healing mean to you? I think it's really important for you to understand what your healing could be, because the future you wants to meet the most healthiest version of you. And if you don't have the tools within your toolkit, or you're not helping remove barriers for people on your team, then people can't have the healing and the psychological safety that they need. As we kind of wind down here soon, I want to talk about a couple of things. And I call these the greatest hits, because what ends up happening inside the workplace is that oftentimes when someone does say their piece or have a difficult conversation, oftentimes part of the trauma that we're experiencing is being dismissed. And instead of um, coming, if I say that I'm going to come to my manager and have a conversation, what often happens is we're met with, I didn't mean any harm. You took it the wrong way. That's just so and so being so and so. Let me tell you, if these are sentences in your lexicon, remove them, because this is re-triggering your employees, your staff, every time you say that. Again, two things can be true at the same time. The impact might not have been that. They might not have meant harm, but it was harmful to the person on the receiving end of it. So it's really important that we take our egos out of it and we hear them out, right? Yes, you didn't mean any harm, but the next thing that should come out of your mouth should be, I apologize. And it's actually a privilege that somebody would feel comfortable and safe enough to come and tell you that this is the situation. But you know what happens? We're so concerned about, is somebody calling us sexist? Is somebody calling us racist? Is somebody calling us homophobic? That we're not even humanizing the experience and thinking about the courage that it took for somebody to come to you and tell you this, not because they want to demonize you, but because they want to remove this barrier for themselves. Right. And I think we really need to take a strong, hard look at the courage that it takes for someone to tell you that this is causing them harm, and for you to be a courageous listener, to hear them out, not to make it about you. I apologize. I didn't know, I didn't mean to say that, but I'm so happy that now you said it. So now I don't have to continue doing that. Right. I teach a course at NYU, and one semester, many years ago, I thought, wow, I want to create this safe space inside the classroom. So I thought, at the time we weren't using a lot of pronouns, and I said, I want my students to feel like they can use whatever pronouns they want inside of the course. And so on the first day of class, I ask everybody to go around and say their names, their bios, and their pronouns. And at the end of class, and to be honest, at the time I thought, oh man, I'm probably one of the only professors doing this. I'm patting myself on the back, making it about me, right, in my mind. Well intentioned, but and I'm laughing about it now because I thought I was doing this big deal, right? And at the end of class, one of my students comes to me and says, Professor Harts, I want to talk to you about something. I want to acknowledge that what you did at class about having everybody use their pronouns, I appreciate you doing that. But I also wanted to make you aware that maybe there are people in class who are not comfortable saying their pronouns. They feel like there might be being outed, and I just wanted to make you aware of that. And instead of making it about me, the next thing that came out of my mouth was, thank you for feeling safe enough to tell me that, because it wasn't my intention to make anybody feel uncomfortable and or come out if they didn't feel comfortable doing that. And I was not aware of how that could land. And so thank you, because the thing is, I knew that the power dynamics might be weird, right? I'm sure it took a lot of courage for her to come and tell me that. And I thought about what she said. And the next time I taught the class, instead of doing it the way that I did it before, I on the board listed 5 things, one being pronouns. And I said, hey, as we go around and give our introductions and our bios, you choose 3 of the 5 things that you want to share. I signaled to the group that I want this to be a safe place. I want people to bring the best pieces and the healthiest pieces of themselves, but they get to choose that, right? And because I had that information, I got to create a safer space. And so I want you to think about it, even if you're not from a marginalized communities, how do we remove barriers for people so they're not re-traumatized, right? Because when we hit people's triggers, we're re-traumatizing them, and that creates cycles of abuse. And I know that none of us want to intentionally create abusive work environments. And so thinking about the things that we say and we do, not just in the meetings but in emails, right, thinking about all those different things and how they land on people is really, really important. The other part of our healing is something I want to touch on called the manager's pledge. Because as we're individually doing our healing, we also need to make sure that our leaders and our managers are equipped to manage diverse communities, diverse teams, right? And so it's important that after a weekend of maybe racialized shootings or hate crimes, that we understand how to show up for our team, not just pretend that these things aren't happening. And so one thing in Right Within is I lean into how do we create psychological safety inside the workplace on our teams on the micro levels. right? I don't think it's any manager's intention to traumatize their employees, but everybody on your team may not experience the same type of manager, right? Or the same type of opportunities. And so I'm asking managers to commit to everyday acts of equity, even when we make a mistake, even when we traumatize someone, that we will recommit to equity. So commit to equity each and every day. Equity should no longer be optional, but it has to be mandatory. We have to walk this thing out. We have to demonstrate it. It's not enough to say that this is Pride Month or this is Juneteenth or any of those different, Black History Month or Equal Pay Day if we're not demonstrating what that looks like. If the communities are not experiencing safety, and that means that we have to commit to it each and every day. As my belief, and you can tweet me or message me and challenge me on this, but as a manager, as a leader, our number one goal should be removing barriers and not creating more. And sometimes, if we're honest with ourselves as managers, we're creating more barriers for some of the people on our team, which is traumatic. Okay. And so it's so important that we commit to those everyday acts of equity. Amy Edmondson, she coined the term psychological safety. And just for, level setting here, she says, where people are not full of fear and trying to cover their tracks to avoid being embarrassed or punished. And if anybody is feeling that way on your team, then it's not safe. Right. And oftentimes I'll hear some leaders in dominant culture say, well, the Black women on my team or the, insert identity here, they haven't said anything, so it must not be a problem. And I said, that could be true. But what also could be true is that you haven't created the psychological safety for people to feel like they can be comfortable telling you because they've seen in demonstration that it's not safe for them. And just because you want to have a conversation about race today and you want to do a listening tour, think about the messaging that has been sent to communities of colors for years. I know when I entered the workplace through a good portion of my career is don't play the race card, don't make it about race. All those sorts of things were being said. And now we're telling people, talk about race, tell me how you feel. That's a weird juxtaposition. We also had to create space for people to feel safe to do it because for so long we weren't. And that's traumatic, right? So giving people the space and the grace to be able to do that. And if nobody is safe, then the workplace is not safe. And so we have to make sure that we're, again, how can we make the workplace work for everybody and creating that psychological safety? But at the core of it is trust. How can people trust you again? Maybe you did make a lot of mistakes. Maybe you did trigger. Maybe you did have some micro and macro aggressions that were taking place yesterday. But what can you do differently today? How can you remove those barriers? Let's not let Tom continue to be Tom if it's harming the rest of the team, right? And so thinking about some of those behaviors and patterns that we can remove barriers for. I know we've talked about a lot, and we're going through the Cliff Notes version of a whole book that I hope that you will read or listen to. But there's a lot of challenges inside the workplace, but there's so many more opportunities because you know what? The work that we're doing today, we get to make the workplace better than we found it. The things that we're talking about today and working on, hopefully, we're solving for the future generations so they don't have to experience some of the inequalities that we are solving for right now. But it's going to take all of us. Our success is not a solo sport. So as we wind down, I want you to think about we have two options. We always have options. We can be cautious or we can be courageous. And so many more people benefit when we are courageous in the workplace to remove the barriers, to talk about the things that we need to name, and to create policies and procedures to dismantle the status quo. Our intention versus impact. Oftentimes we're saying and doing all the things, but what is the demonstration? How is this impact? Just because we say that it's Pride Month or we say that it's Black History Month or Women's History Month, women, do the people of color, do those who sit at various intersections, do they feel that safety? Or is it just in name only? So making sure our intention really is impactful to those in which we're doing the work for. Passive versus active, none of this work is going to get done. We're not going to create safety just because we say it 10 times fast. We're not going to get anywhere we need to unless we're active. Even when I talk about allyship, and I think it's important to say because part of healing the workplace is we're going to need some active allies. And as allies, I want to ask you a question to kind of jot down and you think about what that answer could be for you. But who's a beneficiary of your allyship? We have all of these allies out here running around inside the workplace, but who's benefiting from you being an ally? And that's part of healing the workplace. We need some very active allies because nobody benefits when we're all passive. We'll just keep talking about the same things each and every year if we're not actively demonstrating what healthy environments look like. And one of my other favorite authors, Toni K. Bambara, she had a question that she posed in one of her writings, her essays back in the 70s. She said, "Do you really want to be well?" And if you've experienced any trauma in the workplace, healing can be scary, it can be messy, but it'll always be worth it. And I hope you know that your mental health is always worth it. If you're in an environment that's causing you trauma, what are the tools that you need? I talked about the affirmation pyramid, but there's also a lot of other tools inside of Right Within, as well as therapy, life coaches, you know, talk to your squad. You don't have to suffer in silence, but take the steps, use your tools, have the conversations. A lot of the stuff that we're talking about today is really about having courageous conversations. Oftentimes, we're in situations where we are being harmed, or we haven't created the boundaries. We haven't had the hard conversations. And one tip that I want you to think about the next time you have to have a hard conversation is to say what you mean without saying it mean. If we all engage in courageous conversations in the workplace, then they become normal and they no longer have to be courageous because that's what we're talking about because we're not opting in to equity, it's mandatory. And so I hope you got something out of today's conversation. I hope you will continue to think about what your healing personally looks like, but then also as a leader, as a manager, how can you remove barriers for those on your team who have experienced any type of workplace traumas? Again, I don't think that any of us wake up in the morning and go to work and say, who can I traumatize today? Right? But some of the behaviors that we've allowed to run wild in the workplace is really causing a lot of people trouble. And some of us have pushed those experiences so far back that we'll even tell ourselves that there's nothing to see here as well. But once we start unpack that, you're going to get to a freer place. And one definition of freedom is no longer feeling confined. And my goal is that we all feel a little bit freer inside the workplace because that's when we can all be our most healthiest self and most productive. Thank you so much.